The applause echoed like static in Grace's ears as the grand doors creaked open. She stepped forward slowly, each heel striking the marble with surgical precision. The room was a sea of strangers wearing polished masks. Media moguls, politicians, CEOs, all gathered not for love, but for image. A cathedral draped in orchids and lies. Grace's white satin gown shimmered beneath the chandelier, but she felt no warmth. Her eyes scanned the crowd until they locked onto him, Robert Redgrave, older than the last time she saw him, still terrifyingly composed. Next to Robert stood her groom, Andrew Redgrave, handsome, carefree, and blissfully unaware. He offered her a lopsided grin, oblivious to the magnitude of the game he had just stepped into. Grace smiled back gently as the weight of the veil over her head became symbolic. She was veiled in more than fabric. She was veiled in history, loss, and the promise she made 12 years ago. Find the truth. Burn the roots. Her father's last words before he disappeared. The ceremony unfolded with rehearsed elegance. The priest read sacred vows that meant nothing. Grace's fingers didn't tremble as she slipped the ring onto Andrew's hand, but her chest tightened when Robert nodded approvingly from the front row. That nod wasn't for love. It was acknowledgement, recognition that she had crossed the threshold. She was inside, a lamb among wolves, only she had the fangs. Later, in the grand ballroom of the Redgrave estate, champagne flowed, and laughter clinked across crystal. Grace moved like a ghost among the elite, smiling at backhanded compliments and faux curiosity. "And what does your family do, dear?" asked a woman in pearls. Grace's answer was calm. "They used to publish the truth." The woman blinked. Robert, watching from afar, didn't miss it. He raised a glass slowly in her direction, a silent challenge. By midnight, Andrew had vanished into the crowd, trading toasts and cigars with cousins and college friends. Grace stood at the window of the east corridor, the garden glimmering under moonlight. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and whispered, "You were right, Dad. It's hollow. All of it." She reached into her clutch and pulled out a thin photo. Her father, Henry Holloway, standing in front of the Redgrave Tribune building, smiling, alive. Upstairs in the bridal suite, she changed out of the wedding dress and into a midnight blue robe. Her reflection in the mirror didn't blink. She reached beneath the mattress, retrieving a notebook, worn leather, stitched with thread, pages lined with dates, codes, and clippings. One page was titled, Day 1. She picked up a pen and wrote, "Robert watched me all night, just like before, but this time I'm watching back." A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Clara Redgrave, Andrew's aunt. Her presence was unsettling, always quiet, always observing. Clara stepped in without invitation. "You're calm," she said, not as a compliment, but a test. Grace shrugged. "Nerves aren't useful." Clara studied her for a long beat. "Your father's name was Henry Holloway, wasn't it?" Grace's smile faltered. "You remember him?" Clara's response was surgical. "Of course. He was the only journalist Robert ever feared." The silence between them was pregnant. Clara moved closer, lowering her voice. "Be careful what you dig for here. This family doesn't bury secrets, it erases them." She turned and left before Grace could answer. Alone again, Grace sat on the edge of the bed, every breath suddenly louder in her chest. If Clara knew, others would follow. She wasn't as invisible as she hoped, and invisibility was her greatest weapon. Downstairs, the staff moved with discreet urgency, resetting floral arrangements and sweeping away the night. One of the butlers, an older man named Ellis, paused as Grace passed him in the hallway. He glanced at her, and for a split second, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition. She stopped. "Have we met?" she asked. He shook his head politely. "Only in passing, ma'am." But Grace knew that look. He remembered Henry too. In the study, Robert Redgrave sat in solitude, sipping scotch, his fingers tapping against the carved mahogany desk. A folder sat open in front of him. Inside, an old article written by Henry Holloway, margins marked with pen, underlined phrases, red circles. At the bottom, in Robert's script, "Find out if the girl remembers." Back in her suite, Grace opened a hidden compartment in her luggage, revealing a tiny flash drive embedded in the spine of a hairbrush. She connected it to her laptop and clicked on a file named eulogy.mp4. Her father's voice crackled through the speakers. "If you're hearing this, it means I failed, but maybe you won't." Her breath caught in her throat. "The Redgraves have buried more than you can imagine, but if you're smart, Grace, if you're careful, you might survive long enough to finish this." As the sun began to rise, she wrote in the notebook, "Day 1 complete. Robert is watching, Clara is remembering, and Andrew still thinks this is a love story." She closed the book and whispered, "But it's not. It's a reckoning." The morning after the wedding, Grace wandered the Redgrave Gardens alone. The estate grounds were unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that pressed on the skin. She paused by a marble fountain etched with the Redgrave crest, a lion with a pen in its jaws. The symbolism stung. Her father had always said, "Power doesn't fear the sword, it fears the sentence." She sat on a stone bench, sunlight slicing through the hedges, and opened the small notebook again. The entry she'd never been able to finish was still there. "The last time I saw him," her pen hovered. 12 years earlier, Grace stood on the steps of her high school, clutching her bag, waiting for her dad. He was late. Again. Henry Holloway was a storm of a man, all passion and disorganized brilliance. A former Pulitzer-nominated journalist, once adored, now largely dismissed. But to Grace, he was everything. That afternoon, though, the car never came. Instead, her aunt picked her up, hands shaking. "There was an accident," she'd whispered. "They found his car near the cliffs. But there was no body. Just shattered glass, a burned wallet, and a single page from a notebook. Partially charred. It read, 'Redgrave knew, Redgrave paid, Redgrave buried.' No one believed it. The police closed the case in 2 weeks. Suicide, they said. Depression, stress, a man who couldn't handle failure. But Grace knew better. Henry had been on the verge of something. He had told her to be ready. She just didn't know for what. Back in the present, Grace paced the East Wing hallway. The entire section had been closed off for renovation since the fire 20 years ago. A security keycard hung from a keypad, blinking red. She reached for it instinctively, but footsteps behind her stopped her cold. It was Ellis again, the butler. "May I help you, ma'am?" he asked, voice neutral. Grace turned slowly. "What happened to this wing?" Ellis hesitated. There was a fire. The library and archives were destroyed. It was unfortunate. His eyes flicked to the door. "And some things are better left in the ashes." Grace didn't press further. Not yet. That evening, during dinner, the family gathered in the Rosewood dining hall, dozens of guests, all smiling and polished. Robert sat at the head, flanked by advisors and close family. Andrew beside Grace, toasting lazily. Halfway through the meal, Robert tapped his glass. "To the newest member of the Redgrave legacy," he said. "May her loyalty match her beauty." The words were soft, but the stare that followed was razor-sharp. Grace smiled, but her pulse roared in her ears. She raised her glass. "To legacies, then. May the truth they're built on be strong enough to survive scrutiny." Several guests chuckled awkwardly. Andrew shifted uncomfortably. Robert only blinked, then smiled. "Indeed." Later that night, Grace returned to her room and opened her laptop. She pulled up an encrypted folder labeled HH Files and clicked. On one entry, "Final interview notes, 4/09/2012. Henry's voice again, fragmented, cautious. He uses the trust to hide payouts. There's an island company, Harrogate Global. Check Clara's signature. It's all under her name. Grace paused the file. Clara? The next morning, Grace waited for Clara by the breakfast conservatory. When she arrived, Grace acted casual. "I've always admired your loyalty to the family," she said. Clara smiled thinly. "Loyalty is a transaction here, not a value." Grace leaned in. "Did you know my father?" Clara hesitated. "He interviewed me once, off the record, said he was writing a piece on legacy corruption. I told him to be careful, but Henry was never careful." She stirred her tea. "He said he had proof that Robert falsified corporate records in '98. Then he disappeared." Grace blinked slowly, concealing her surge of emotion. "Do you believe he was silenced?" Clara's voice was quiet. "I believe this family has never needed a bullet when a signature and a headline could kill just as cleanly." Later, in the estate's private library, Grace searched through the old donation books. She found Harrogate Global, and there it was, an entry dated 2 months before Henry's disappearance, a donation made in Clara's name to a wellness clinic in upstate New York. Her fingers froze. The same clinic where Henry had once gone undercover to investigate experimental drug testing. Was that where he died? She copied the details, slipped the paper into her notebook, and stared out the window. The rain had started, soft and steady, the kind her father loved. She could almost hear his voice. "Find the cracks, Grace. That's where the light comes in." Downstairs, Robert Redgrave met privately with a man in a grey suit. "She's digging," he said. The man nodded. "Want me to start watching her?" Robert sipped his drink. "Don't watch her, distract her. Send Andrew on a honeymoon proposal, somewhere far, and find out if Holloway had backups." Back in her suite, Grace stared at the paper. She looked up the address of the Harrogate Wellness Center, still active, still privately funded. She wrote one final line in her notebook that night. He never jumped, he was pushed, and someone paid to make sure no one looked twice. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the mansion's high windows, casting long shadows on the bare parquet floors. Grace walked the east corridor, the paper with Harrogate's address folded tightly in her palm. The silence of the estate was unnerving, like it was holding its breath. She had barely slept. The memory of her father's voice in that corrupted audio file haunted her. "They will try to shame you into silence. Don't let them." She wouldn't, not now. Downstairs, Robert Redgrave was already seated in the solarium, reading a leather-bound agenda. The way he flipped each page, mechanically, deliberately, reminded Grace of a surgeon prepping for surgery. She approached slowly, cautiously. "Good morning," she said coolly. Robert looked up, his smile measured. "Grace, settling in, I trust?" She nodded. "The house has its echoes." Robert gestured for her to sit. "This estate was built on reputation, which is fragile, like glass. One fracture and it shatters." Grace sat, but didn't lean back. "And yet it survived a fire." His eyes flicked, a glint. Not everything survived. Silence stretched between them. Then Robert leaned forward, voice calm. "Andrew is planning a honeymoon. Paris, perhaps. Or the coast. It would do you good to disappear for a while." Grace smiled faintly. "And what if I'm not ready to disappear?" Robert set his glass down. "Then you should be very certain of what you're chasing." Later that day, Grace found Andrew in the West Garden, hunched over his phone, swiping through resorts. "Want mountains or beaches?" he asked. She sat beside him, careful. "I thought we could postpone. I'd like to explore the estate a bit more, learn the family's history." Andrew chuckled. "You'll be bored in 10 minutes. Everything's Documented, sanitized. Grace tilted her head. Even the fire? He blinked. Which one? She studied him. There was more than one. Andrew shrugged. Some old archives burned down when my uncle was restructuring the library, years ago, before I was old enough to care. But Grace cared. She remembered the Harrogate note. Her father's cryptic mention of hidden testimony buried in ash. There was something behind those walls. That night, she returned to the east corridor again, quietly, keypad blinking. This time, she waited. A staff member passed by, a maid with a keycard on. Her hip. Grace followed at a distance, then slipped into the restricted wing behind her. The air changed instantly, mustier, untouched, preserved. She moved through the shadows, fingertips grazing scorched wallpaper. It wasn't just a fire, it was a purge. In what was once a records room, she found charred filing cabinets. Most drawers were empty or melted shut, but one had been forced open. Inside, fragments, photos, blackened ledgers. A corner of a news clipping, half burned. Former Tribune editor says he has proof of... That was her father's case, his last story. Her pulse quickened. She took what she could and retreated, but not quickly enough. In the hallway, she turned the corner and stopped short. Clara stood there, silent, hands in her coat pockets. Curiosity is brave, she said, but bravery without a plan is suicide. Grace met her gaze. Why was this wing closed for real? Clara hesitated. Because Robert needed it to be, and no one was brave enough to stop him. Back in her room, Grace examined the damaged clipping. It mentioned a name she hadn't seen before, James Valen. A source? A whistleblower? She opened her laptop and searched. Nothing came up, not in news archives, not in public records. It was like the man never existed or had been erased. She scribbled his name in the margin beside Harrogate. Red ink. A new thread. Andrew knocked on the door around midnight. "You're not sleeping?" he asked, voice laced with concern. She shrugged. Too much to take in. He kissed her forehead. "We could still go away, somewhere quiet. We don't have to be Redgraves. And for a week." But Grace wasn't pretending to be a Redgrave. She was dismantling them from the inside. The next morning, she made a call. A contact her father once trusted, a woman named Elise, an archivist turned private researcher. "I need you to find someone," she whispered. "Name's James Valen. He may have worked for or against Robert Redgrave around 2012. Elise's pause was long. Then, "I've heard that name. He disappeared after testifying. Unofficially, I'll dig." Grace thanked her and hung up. Later at lunch, Robert stood once again before the family and gave a toast. "The Redgraves have always been a family of clarity. No scandal, no noise. We protect what matters." His gaze slid toward Grace. "And silence, when preserved, becomes legacy." She raised her glass but said nothing. Yet. That night, Elise messaged her. "Found him. Alive. Under protection. But there's a catch. He won't talk without seeing Henry's files." Grace sat in the dark, laptop screen glowing, the estate pulsing quietly around her. She scrolled to the encrypted folder and hovered over Holloway Final, and then she whispered, "I hope you're still watching, Dad, because I'm about to show them exactly what they tried to erase." Grace sat at her desk, laptop open, staring at the file she had hesitated to access for years. Holloway Final, her father's last encrypted archive. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her breath shallow. She entered the passphrase, silent sentence 91, the one he used in all his notes. The folder opened. Inside, dozens of files labeled with code names: Foxglove, Ashroot, Covenant, Redgrave Memo 6. She opened one at random. It was a voice memo. Her father's voice was brittle, tired. "They know I'm onto them, but it's not Robert that worries me. It's Clara. She's not just complicit, she's the architect." The betrayal hit like a slap. Clara, the woman who had warned her, who had hinted at danger, wasn't a bystander. She was part of it. Grace closed the file quickly, unsure of what to feel. Her instinct had been to trust Clara. Was that instinct wrong, or was her father mistaken paranoid in the end? She needed clarity, not assumption, and clarity, she'd learned, was always hidden in patterns. That day, the estate felt more watchful. The staff was stiff, conversations clipped. Grace noticed a pattern in how they moved, how rooms were cleared just before she entered. She wandered to the gallery and found a small camera tucked beneath. A sculpture pedestal, not Redgrave property, hers. She'd planted it days ago. It had recorded hours of hallway footage. She skimmed through it and paused. One scene stood out, Robert speaking to Ellis, the butler. The audio was faint, but one phrase cut through. "She's digging in the ashes. If she finds it, the council unravels." What council? Grace knew now that she was dealing with more than just a corrupt man. This was a structure, a framework, a network within the family. She needed to see it. She went to the study, a room rarely used by anyone but Robert. He was gone for the afternoon. The door wasn't locked. Inside, shelves lined with untouched books, but Grace moved to the fireplace. Above it, a mounted crest, a lion and quill. She pulled on it, remembering one of her father's sketches. It gave a mechanical click. A panel in the wall slid open. Behind it, a metal drawer with a biometric lock. She pressed her finger. Access denied. She left, but not without noticing the smudge of fingerprints on the lion's paw. Clara's ring left a mark there the last time she was in the room. Grace filed it away. She was starting to understand this house. It wasn't a home. It was a vault. That evening, Andrew was restless. He paced the master bedroom like a caged animal. "You've been quiet," he said. "Is everything okay?" Grace watched him. "Why did your family keep records of journalists who investigated them?" His smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" She didn't answer. He sat down slowly. "You think we killed your father." The words hung in the air like smoke. Grace said nothing. Andrew exhaled. "Look, my family. They're cold. Strategic, but murder. That's not how they work. They bury people in silence, not in dirt." She nodded. "Exactly. And my father screamed." Andrew rubbed his face. "Grace, if there's something going on, you need to tell me. Because I'm caught in the middle of something I didn't sign up for." She looked at him, eyes sharp. "No, Andrew, you were born into it. I walked in." Later that night, she messaged Elise, "Ready to meet Valen. I have what he asked for." She met Elise at a rented flat across the city, nondescript and dark. Inside, a man sat at the table, grey-bearded, hunched, with eyes that didn't miss a thing. "James Valen," he spoke first. "Your father was the bravest man I ever met. He also knew he wouldn't survive what he uncovered." Grace slid a flash drive across the table. "Then tell me what he died for." Valen nodded. "The Redgrave Doctrine. It's not just about hiding crimes. It's about rewriting bloodlines. They erase threats to their name, legally, socially, and biologically. They pay clinics to fake deaths, to forge mental records. They silence people by unmaking them." He paused. "Your father had proof. The files you brought me, they're part of the story. But there's more. There's a second vault, one he never found." Grace leaned in. "Where?" Valen met her gaze. "Under the east wing, beneath the fire." Back at the estate, Grace entered her room and found a sealed envelope on her pillow. No name. Inside, a single note, typed. "Your father wasn't the only one. Clara chose silence over justice, will you?" Her heart pounded. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she stared out the window, writing one sentence over and over. "Erase me, and I become louder." The next morning, the estate pulsed with an eerie stillness. It was the quiet before a storm. Grace stepped into the east corridor once again, this time with a plan. She carried a stolen staff keycard and wore soft-soled boots. Her father's map, drawn by memory and instinct, had indicated something hidden beneath the fire damage. What James Valen said had only confirmed it. Now she would find it. She reached the scorched library doors and slid the keycard. The lock clicked. The stench of smoke still clung to the walls after decades. Sunlight pierced through fractured glass, casting beams across blackened furniture. But her eyes were on the floor. Grace knelt and ran her fingers across the broken tiles. One in the corner looked newer than the rest. She knocked on it, hollow. Pulling out a small screwdriver from her coat, she pried at the edges until the tile lifted, revealing a steel hatch with a rusted lock. Heart racing, she hesitated. This was the moment, no turning back. She twisted the lock until it broke with a snap, then pulled open the hatch. A narrow staircase spiraled downward into darkness. She clicked on her flashlight and descended. Air was colder than expected, stale but breathable. The walls narrowed as she moved deeper underground. Finally, the passage opened into a room, a vault. Metal cabinets, shelves of leather-bound ledgers, no digital equipment, nothing hackable. This was analog secrecy, preserved from a world before data leaks. She approached the nearest shelf and opened a ledger labeled Benedict Redgrave, Special Trusts. It was all there: bribes, offshore accounts, money trails linked to charities that didn't exist. But one entry made her blood run cold. HH13 Holloway, freeze recommended, status terminated, unconfirmed. Her father's name reduced to a line item, a number, a loose end never officially resolved. She grabbed the ledger and turned to leave, but froze. Someone else had entered the vault. A voice echoed from the stairwell. "You shouldn't be here." "Clara." Grace didn't move. "How long have you known?" she asked. Clara stepped fully into the light. Her face was calm, but her eyes, something in them wavered. "Since before the fire." Grace turned slowly. "You helped them erase my father." Clara flinched. "I tried to stop it, but by then I wasn't just a Redgrave. I was an accomplice. You could have warned him." Clara stepped closer. "And died beside him?" "I was young, foolish, terrified. I tried to protect him. I tried to delay the order. But your father was like you, too loud, too relentless. They made a choice." Grace's fists clenched. "They made a choice to burn him, to burn this." She held up the ledger. "How many others?" Clara looked away. "More than I'll ever admit." Grace shoved the book into her bag and pushed past her. Clara didn't follow. As Grace emerged into the light of the ruined library, her eyes burned. She was shaking, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was rage. Back in her room, she opened the ledger again and began scanning entries. Names she didn't recognize, but patterns she did. Every whistleblower, every disappeared voice had been catalogued here, and many had a status note, untraceable, eliminated, institutionalized. This was a hit list disguised as estate accounting. She called Elise. "Elise, I found it. A physical ledger. There's a whole network under this estate." "Can you scan it?" Elise asked. "I'll do better. I'll publish it." Later that evening, Andrew entered her room without knocking. "I heard you were in the East Corridor again," he said, jaw clenched. "What are you doing, Grace?" She looked at him, tired. "Finding what your family buried." Andrew stepped closer. "My family gave you a life, and your—" "No," she cut him off. "Your family gave me silence. I'm giving it back, in pieces." His face was red. "You're going to destroy this house." She stared him down, then let it burn. That night, she made copies, scans, screenshots, encrypted backups sent to cloud folders under fake identities. The vault may not survive exposure, but the story would. Before sleeping, she opened her father's old notebook again. A line stood out, underlined twice. "Redgrave doesn't fear discovery. It fears memory." She whispered to the dark. "Then let them remember everything. The following morning broke with a kind of stillness that made Grace uneasy. The estate was quiet, too quiet, as if everyone had received instructions to vanish. Even Ellis, the butler, who always hovered near the breakfast hall, was nowhere to be found. Grace sat alone at the long dining table, stirring her tea without drinking. Her eyes were fixed on the far end of the room, on Robert's empty seat. He hadn't shown his face since the night she found the ledger. That silence said everything. Just as she rose to leave, a knock echoed through the stone foyer. Not the usual soft, practiced knock of staff or guests. This was sharp, insistent. Grace walked toward the door herself, heels clicking like gunshots. She opened it cautiously. A woman stood there, tall, late 50s, wrapped in a raincoat. Her hair was streaked with grey, and her eyes were steady. "Grace Holloway?" she asked softly. "Yes," Grace replied. "My name is Isabel Keene. I was your father's source. I was the one who warned him. Too late." Grace's heart thudded against her ribs. "Come in," she said immediately. They sat in the garden conservatory, away from ears, surrounded by cold stone and climbing vines. Isabel opened her worn leather bag and pulled out a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside, a cassette tape and an envelope. "He gave this to me the night before he disappeared," she said. "He said if anything happened, I was to find you." Grace's fingers trembled as she picked up the tape. It had his handwriting on it. "If she survives, let her hear it." Isabel watched her closely. He knew they'd come for him, but he didn't expect them to be so fast. He'd just cracked the name of the man responsible for funding the silencing program. She paused. It wasn't just Robert. It was someone deeper, hidden. Grace narrowed her eyes. "Who?" Isabel reached into her coat again, pulling out a photo. It showed a younger Robert Redgrave, shaking hands with a man whose face was partially blurred by motion. "That," she said, "is Arthur Bellamy, the financier, the one who created the shell companies, the one who erased people." Grace stared at the photo, rage and recognition building in her chest. Her father had always said, "Follow the names no one mentions out loud." Arthur Bellamy hadn't been in the ledgers. He'd been above them. And that made him even more dangerous. Isabel wasn't finished. Henry suspected that Bellamy had ties to international records laundering, disappearing journalists by altering digital trails, forging criminal records, faking psychiatric evaluations. Grace leaned forward. "That sounds like what they did to my mother." Isabel paused, eyes flickering. "Your mother wasn't supposed to be part of this." Grace froze. "What do you mean?" Isabel hesitated. "She got caught in the storm. Henry loved her, yes, but she wasn't the target. She was the warning." Grace's stomach turned. Her mother's slow descent, the paranoia, the years lost, had that been orchestrated too? "She was silenced to keep my father obedient," she whispered. Isabel nodded. They were going to frame him as unstable, but when she started asking questions, she became the perfect substitute. The weight of it nearly crushed her. Her family hadn't just been destroyed, they had been chosen for destruction. Efficient, silent, final. Grace stood and paced. The conservatory, gripping the photo and the tape. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come here?" "Because," Isabel said, "you've shaken them. I heard whispers that Robert's making contingency calls, that they've activated something called Protocol Icarus." Grace's brow furrowed. "What is that?" "A total erasure," Isabel said. "If they can't stop you, they'll discredit you, legally, medically, publicly. They'll say you're paranoid, delusional, just like they did with your mother." Grace felt the ground tilt. "Then I have to move faster." Isabel touched her arm. "You have the ledger. That's your shield. But you need something more." She pulled a small memory card from her sleeve. "Your father's last attempt to record the council meeting 2 months before he died. It's audio only, But it proves Robert, Clara, and Bellamy knew what was happening, and they signed off on it. Grace took it, hand trembling. That night, she returned to her room, locking the door behind her. She placed the memory card in her laptop, pressed play. Henry's voice again, clear and raw. "They've all agreed. I'm the next to be silenced. If Grace finds this, tell her I'm proud. Tell her she's the loudest echo I've ever created." She didn't cry. She stood and whispered, "I won't be an echo. I'll be the earthquake." 2 days after Isabel's visit, Grace sat, alone in the estate's old chapel where no one went anymore. The stained glass was cracked, the pews coated in dust, and silence wrapped around her like smoke. But she liked it there. It was untouched by politics, untouched by legacy. Just history, raw and real. She held the memory card in one hand and her father's wedding band in the other. If she did this, if she stepped forward, there was no returning to shadows. She would be known. She would be hunted. Outside the chapel, the estate was bustling. Security was doubled. Andrew paced the phone in the rose courtyard. Robert hadn't been seen for 36 hours. And Clara, she was quieter than ever. Grace hadn't confronted her about the vault. Not yet. Part of her didn't want to hear the excuse. The other part feared Clara might confess something unforgivable. That afternoon, Grace met with Elise and a trusted journalist named Ryland Voss, an exiled reporter known for broadcasting the stories others feared to touch. They met in a closed studio downtown. "You sure about this?" Ryland asked, adjusting his camera. "Once this goes live, you won't be able to step into a grocery store without a headline behind you." Grace nodded. "They turned my silence into a weapon. I'm taking it back." She sat, faced the camera, took a breath. The broadcast opened with her name. "My name is Grace Holloway. I'm the daughter of Henry Holloway, the journalist who vanished in 2012, and I have proof that he didn't disappear. He was erased." Ryland's mouth parted slightly as she kept speaking. Calm, measured, precise. She laid it out. The red grave, doctrine, the ledger, the audio file from the council meeting, her father's notes, Bellamy's funding, the erased names, the financial shell programs. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She let the words work like fire, silent at first, then consuming. This family has hidden behind wealth and power long enough. They've rewritten people's lives. They've locked them away. They destroyed my father, and now they want to destroy me. So this is my answer. She reached into her bag and placed the original ledger onto the table in front of the camera. The camera zoomed in. Everything they've done, every dollar, every erasure, is in here. The video streamed live for 41 minutes. By the time she returned to the estate, the fallout had already begun. The Redgrave name trended globally. Journalist's daughter accuses elite family of silencing and fraud. Clips of the ledger trended on every platform. Ryland's page broke records. But Grace felt no triumph. She only felt the weight settle more heavily on her shoulders. She had just pulled the pin from a grenade, and now it was rolling under the table. Clara confronted her first. "You went public without telling me?" she asked, voice tight. "You sat on a council recording on the ledger, and you didn't warn me?" Grace's eyes narrowed. "You already knew what was in there, Clara." Clara's lips thinned. "That's not the point." "Isn't it?" Grace snapped. "You're only upset because now you have to pick a side in public." Clara stepped back like she'd been slapped. Upstairs, Andrew stood in her doorway, pale. "The broadcast. I saw it. You called out my family." Grace didn't flinch. "Did I lie?" "No," he admitted. "But I don't know what that makes me anymore." She stared at him, exhausted. "That makes you a man standing in a burning house. Decide if you're going to run or bring water." That night, the retaliation came. The Redgraves released a legal statement calling her a disturbed individual, emotionally unstable, and likely influenced by falsified documents. Robert finally reappeared at a press conference, denying the allegations and citing deep concern for Grace's mental health. They even referenced her mother's institutionalization. The headlines flipped. Was Henry Holloway unstable? Redgrave family denies wild accusations. Grace's inbox flooded with hate and support. In equal measure, some saw her as a whistleblower, others called her a fame-hungry fraud. And then came the letter, slipped under her door, typed, unsigned. If you don't stop now, the next story will be yours. She folded the paper slowly, calmly, and whispered, "Then let them write it. But I'll write the ending." The following morning arrived. Like a hammer, news vans lined the edges of the estate gates. Staff moved in a frenzy. Lawyers flooded the front hall with binders and suits. Robert had taken control of the narrative with cruel efficiency, spinning Grace's revelations into the ravings of a grieving daughter. But inside the estate walls, the silence was darker, denser, the kind that suffocates. Grace stayed in her room most of the day, watching the news scroll across every screen. Her name was everywhere, but her truth was already being diluted. Clara hadn't spoken to her since the confrontation. Andrew was avoiding her entirely. Only Elise remained, in contact, sending encrypted updates. "We're pulling names from the ledger now," Elise wrote. "It's worse than we thought. Dozens of fabricated psychiatric cases, most never resurfaced." That night, Grace crept back into the East Corridor. She needed answers the press couldn't distort. She returned to the vault. With gloves and flashlight, she moved deeper than before, past the ledgers and accounts, past the old file cabinets. At the back of the vault, a second steel box sat locked beneath a stack of decaying frames. It was newer. She picked the lock. Inside, documents marked Project Willow, initiated 1993. She froze. That was the year she was born. She opened the file slowly. Inside, medical forms, lab reports, and a chilling summary. Subject GH. Genetically selected for behavioral tracking, control group 3A. Her stomach turned. GH Grace Holloway. Her name wasn't on any hospital records, not in official databases. That was always her mother's story. Home birth, private midwife. Now she saw why. She wasn't just a daughter. She had been a subject, an experiment. The next folder was worse. Her mother's name, Rebecca Holloway. Diagnosis, fabricated. Institutional order, signed by Arthur Bellamy. The report, patient expressed knowledge of sensitive information, easiest to discredit, initiate confinement under false psychiatric cause. Grace dropped the file. She couldn't breathe. They hadn't just erased her father, they'd tried to erase her existence. She staggered out of the vault and stumbled back into the ruined library. Rain hammered the windows as she braced herself against a wall. It wasn't just about corruption, it was about manufacture. The Redgrave Doctrine hadn't been policy, it had been design. Back in her room, Grace dumped the files onto her desk, scanned every document into a new encrypted folder, then did something she hadn't done in years. She called Clara. Clara answered, quiet. "You need to come here," Grace said. "Now." 10 minutes later, they stood in her room, papers spread across the desk. Grace didn't speak. She let Clara read. The woman's face paled with each page. "Project Willow," she whispered. "God, I thought they killed that idea." Grace's voice was ice. "So it's real." Clara sat down slowly. "I was at the edge of it. I saw the proposal, not the execution. I never knew they chose children. You knew my mother's diagnosis was fake." Clara hesitated, then nodded. "She came to me, begged me to help your father. She said they were being followed. That Robert was watching them. I tried to warn Henry, but he was already preparing to go public. And then... Grace stared at her. You let it happen. I was scared, Clara whispered. You don't understand what Arthur was capable of. Grace stood. I understand exactly what he was capable of. That night she began building a second report. One too horrifying to release without airtight proof. It wasn't just about Redgrave anymore. It was about Willow, the project that built her name, that chose her life, that tried to own her blood. As she uploaded the files, her laptop screen flickered. A message appeared. Unauthorized trace detected. Data copied remotely. Someone had breached her system. Someone had found the vaults. Truth. And Grace realized the next attack wouldn't be legal, it would be personal. The breach came to full light at 7:02 a.m. Grace woke to Elise's panicked voice over the phone. It's everywhere. They leaked your mother's file. Grace jolted upright, heart pounding. What file? Elise hesitated. Not the one from the vault. An earlier one, an arrest, embezzlement, fraud, mugshot included. It's already on the front page of 3 tabloids. Grace felt the world tilt. That's impossible. My mother never... I know, Elise interrupted, but they doctored it, and it's good, real good. Within minutes, her name was back in the headlines. Whistleblower's mother a criminal. Is Grace Holloway another legacy liar? Downstairs, the estate buzzed with tension. Staff whispered in corners. Clara wouldn't answer her door. Andrew was gone. And Robert? He was holding court in the main drawing room with reporters, sipping tea like a monarch among pawns. Grace stood just outside the threshold, listening. She inherited her father's delusions, Robert said calmly, and apparently her mother's ethics. The reporters chuckled. Grace walked away, quietly seething. She returned to her room and opened every file she had on her mother. Nothing matched what they published. The arrest date didn't align with any travel. The case number was fake, but the photo, that was real. Her mother, handcuffed, standing outside a courthouse. It wasn't fabricated, it was buried, and someone had just dug it up. She turned to Clara, who finally appeared at her door an hour later. You knew about this? Grace asked. Clara's face was drawn. Yes, but not like this. I didn't know they'd use it. I thought it was gone. She sat down, looking old suddenly. Your mother worked for Arthur Bellamy, briefly. She was his legal assistant. She got access to documents she wasn't meant to see. She tried to report them. And suddenly, she was the criminal. Grace's throat tightened. She took the fall. Clara nodded. She was framed. Bellamy forged invoices, rerouted payments in her name. Your father tried to clear her record, but the Redgraves bought the judge. Grace stared at the photo again, searching for a clue. Then she noticed something, tiny, nearly invisible, a wristband on her mother's arm. Not from jail, from a clinic. She zoomed in, sharpened the image. There it was, Harrogate Wellness Centre, the same place Grace had traced through the fake charities. The same name buried in ledgers in Robert's financial trail. Her mother hadn't just been arrested, she'd been taken there, institutionalized, again. And now the leak made sense. They weren't trying to shame Grace with her mother's criminal record. They were trying to distract her from what that record proved. That's why they needed her gone, Grace whispered. She knew where the bodies were, and she had access to the paper trail. Clara leaned in. You need to find what she was trying to expose. That night, Grace revisited her father's. Final audio again. Rebecca found something I missed, something hidden even deeper. If she disappears, follow the trail through Harrogate. It leads to the origin. The origin. She remembered a phrase from the Willow file. Behavioral. Tracking. Origin protocol. That was it. Her mother had discovered Willow, and instead of killing her, they used her as a warning, as a puppet, as a test. The next day, Grace held a press conference of her own, alone in front of the estate. No lawyers, no lights, just a single camera. "I'm not going to deny the photo," she said. "My mother was arrested, and then she was erased, because she discovered something this family never wanted the world to see." She paused, then looked directly into the camera. "Let's talk about Project Willow." And the silence on the estate exploded. That night, someone broke into her room. They didn't take the laptop. They didn't touch the safe. They left one thing behind, a photo of Grace as a baby, next to another infant labeled in red ink, "Willow subject 3B. Grace clutched the photo, her mind spinning. There had been another child, someone else, someone still out there, and maybe watching. The photo sat on Grace's desk for hours, untouched. She couldn't stop staring at it. Two babies, no more than a few months old, swaddled in sterile hospital linen, their faces nearly identical. One was her. The other had no name, just the tag, Willow Subject 3B. She felt something tighten in her chest. A twin, a sibling, a mirror. Who was this other child, and why had no one ever spoken of them? She scanned the photo for clues. The edges were crisp, no water damage, no fading. Recent. Someone had been holding on to it. Someone had wanted her to see it. The back had a faint watermark, Northlight Imaging 1993. Grace searched the name. It was a lab, long closed, shut down in 2001 for unauthorized genetic records duplication, government whispers, lawsuit sealed. She called Elise. "There's a second subject," she said. "Another baby from Willow. I need to find out who they became." Elise was quiet for a long moment. "I've heard rumors," she said finally, "that the project had multiple phases. They weren't just monitoring you, they were comparing control versus variable. You may not be the only one they tracked." "Where's the other child?" Grace asked. "We don't know. The files are redacted, but some survivors say 3B went missing during the fire at Ridgeport Clinic in '98. Grace blinked. "Fire? Same year the Redgraves lost their East Gallery." Grace didn't need a map to connect those dots. She grabbed her coat, the photo, and the files she'd pulled from the vault. She drove through the rain for hours to reach the Ridgeport ruins. The old clinic stood like a carcass, roof half collapsed, walls sagging. No security, no warnings, just vines and silence. Inside, time had stopped. Broken beds, shattered windows, scorched tile. She followed her father's sketches, found the patient logbook sealed in a plastic crate beneath collapsed beams. Most names were indecipherable, but two entries stood out. Subject 3A, relocated to Harrogate. Subject 3B, status unfit, transferred to ARC facility. Grace whispered the name aloud. "ARC?" She called Elise again. "What's ARC?" she asked. Elise's voice dropped. "The archives of Redgrave contingencies. A secret holding. Not a clinic, a containment site. For children. For problems," Elise said. Grace left Ridgeport with a new target. ARC. If she could find it, she could find the other child, the one who shared her face, her blood, her fate, back. At the estate, she returned to her room and froze. Clara was waiting inside. "You found it, didn't you?" Clara asked, her voice low. Grace nodded slowly. "There was another, a second subject." Clara exhaled. "They told me she didn't survive, that she was unstable, but I never saw. Her body, just paperwork and Arthur's word." "Who was she?" Grace asked. Clara didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out a file. Yellowed, scorched at the edges. She laid it on Grace's bed. "This was in the family archives. I stole it years ago. Couldn't destroy it." Grace opened it carefully. Inside, test, results, behavioral assessments, and finally, a name. Name, Annalise Vale. Subject 3B. Last known status, undocumented. Annalise Vale, Grace whispered. She's real. She was like you, Clara said. Smart, observant, but volatile. They tried to mold her. She resisted. That's when Arthur moved her to ARC. Grace held the file against her chest. I need to find her. She may not want to be found. Grace looked up, fire in her eyes. Then I'll find her anyway. Later that night, she went back to the vault, found a drawer labeled Archives External, ARC. Inside, coordinates, a rural address in Vermont, a medical log with Annalise's initials, and a single phrase, stamped in red, active. Annalise was alive. But where? And more importantly, what had they turned her into? The drive to Vermont was endless, the woods blurring past like memories she didn't want to revisit. Grace had memorized the coordinates pulled from the ARC files. Elise had confirmed it. A decommissioned estate off-grid, listed under a shell foundation tied to Bellamy's original asset tree. If Annalise was still alive, if she had escaped or been kept, this is where she'd be. The house appeared. Through the trees like a ghost, a Victorian ruin swallowed by moss and time. Grace parked the car a mile away and walked the rest, boots crunching frost. When she reached the front steps, she hesitated. This wasn't a rescue, this was a reckoning. She knocked. No answer. She stepped inside. Dust. Silence. But signs of life. A fire recently put out, an open can of paint, journals scattered across, a desk, then footsteps, light, slow, and then a voice. You're not Redgrave. Grace turned. There she was, Annalise Vale. Same face, same eyes, but darker, sharper, scarred at the wrist. She leaned in the doorway like someone who'd forgotten how to rest. I watched your broadcast, she said. You're loud. I had to be, Grace replied. They buried us. Annalise nodded once. They didn't bury me. They tried. I crawled out. Grace stepped closer. They said you were unstable. A cold laugh. They made me unstable. Grace held up the old photo. You remember this? Annalise looked, flinched. I burned my copy years ago. Grace lowered her voice. They used us, Annalise. We were meant to prove something, but we don't have to finish what they started. Annalise's jaw clenched. You want to heal. I want to expose. They need to burn, all of them. Grace paused. Then help me. I have evidence, testimonies, the ledger, the second vault. We go public again. This time with everything. Annalise stared. You think truth matters to people like Robert, to Bellamy? They'll buy the judges, burn the files, smear us both. Again. Grace walked forward. Then we outnumber them. I have the world's attention. You have the missing. Half of the story. Annalise sat down slowly. Her hands trembled. They locked me in that place for 4 years, said I was defective, that my silence proved failure. But it wasn't silence, it was strategy. Grace handed her a copy of the ARC release log. Time to speak. Back at the estate, Grace returned with Annalise, hidden in the back seat. She slipped her in through the gallery, through old servants' corridors. Clara met them in the cellar. One look at Annalise, and she froze. It's like seeing a ghost, she whispered. Annalise raised a brow. Then bury me again, I dare you. But Clara didn't speak. She simply stepped aside. 2 days later, Grace announced another broadcast. This time, it streamed from inside the Redgrave mansion itself. The entire estate was her stage. Clara stood beside her, Annalise, off camera, monitoring the feed. Robert didn't show, neither did Bellamy, but they would feel this one. Grace spoke. She showed the files, the tests, the recordings, the erased women, the manipulated children. She spoke of Willow, of ARC, of Project Origin, of her sister. Yes, sister. She named Annalise as the second subject, And then she did the unthinkable. She stepped away from the camera and let Annalisa speak, the woman who was supposed to vanish, the voice they never expected to hear. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just told the truth. And for a long, terrifying second, the world listened. The days following the second broadcast were unlike anything Grace had ever lived through. The internet cracked in half. Half the world praised her as a symbol of resistance, two sisters broken by a machine, fighting their way back. The other, half brutal. Headlines screamed, "Are the Holloway girls mentally fit?" Anchors speculated about trauma, manipulation, even conspiracy between Grace and her alleged twin. But none of that mattered, because the Redgraves were bleeding. Stocks fell, investigations opened, donations dried up, sponsors vanished. Clara's name disappeared from 3 public boards. Andrew's cousin posted a public apology, calling the family a monument built on silence and fraud. Inside the mansion, the air had turned bitter. Servants avoided eye contact. Rooms that once radiated opulence now felt haunted. Robert had gone underground. No public statement, no appearances. But Grace knew better. Silence wasn't absence. Silence was preparation. Clara approached her late one night in the library. "He's calling in Bellamy," she said. "That's the final card. If Arthur shows his face, it means they're ready to burn something or someone." "Let him come," Grace said. But Annalisa wasn't so patient. "He'll twist it," she hissed. "He always does. The second he steps into the light, he'll spin it. We need more." "Like what?" "Like what started all of this." Grace paused. "You mean the Redgrave Protocol?" Annalisa nodded. "He didn't just build the doctrine. He sold it. Overseas, to clients, governments, private firms. We weren't just experiments. We were a proof of concept." Grace felt her breath vanish. "How do you know?" "I read the blue folder." "What blue folder?" Annalisa looked away. "I found it in the ARC archives. I didn't tell you." Grace's stomach dropped. "Why?" "Because I didn't trust you yet." Grace stepped back. "After all this, you still don't?" Annalisa's face hardened. "You want justice. I want insurance." They stared at each other, sisters only by biology, and war by everything else. Later, Grace confronted Clara. "What's the blue folder?" Clara went white. "You found it?" "I didn't. She did. Tell me what it is." Clara sank into the armchair, staring into the dark fireplace. "It's the inheritance." Grace blinked. "What?" "The real one. The origin files. Bellamy's records. The ones Henry tried to steal before he died." Grace felt the floor sway. "It was never about your father. Not fully. It was about ownership. Bellamy created the doctrine, but the Redgraves financed it. The folder proves the profit, proves the trade." "Where is it?" Clara whispered. "In the walls." They went to the east corridor, back to the vault. But Clara led her to a different panel, not in the vault room, in the gallery, behind a cracked mural. She pried it open. Inside, a sealed titanium case. Coded. Clara entered a sequence. Click. Inside, blueprints, ledgers, contracts. The full Redgrave doctrine exported, licensed, enforced. 37 countries. Dozens of names Grace recognized. Politicians, CEOs, foreign agents. And then, a single handwritten page. "If I die, Grace inherits everything. The files, the proof, the truth. HH." Her father's final act wasn't journalism. It was a legacy. Grace sat in silence, overwhelmed. Clara stood behind her, quiet. And in the corner of the room, Annalise watched, not smiling, not grieving, just calculating. The press conference came without warning. Midday, under a white tent in the city's government square, Robert Redgrave appeared, flanked by attorneys, bodyguards, and to Grace's horror, Arthur Bellamy himself. The man was older than she remembered from her father's clippings, silver hair slicked back, blue eyes sharp and unblinking. He spoke first. There's been a coordinated campaign of misinformation and emotional blackmail waged against this. A family, Grace Holloway, and an individual calling herself Annalisa Vale, have fabricated documents, stolen property, and distorted historical context for personal gain. Reporters exploded with questions. Grace watched the live stream from the study, fists clenched, and then Robert took the microphone. However, he said, voice cool, we are not seeking vengeance. We are offering a ceasefire. A murmur swept the crowd. We request one meeting, one conversation, behind closed doors, one last chance for the Holloway girl to return to reason before irreversible damage is done. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a threat, and the world heard it loud and clear. That night, Annalise was pacing like a caged wolf. We don't go, she said. It's a trap, always is. Grace nodded. Yes, but sometimes you walk into the trap so you can see who's holding the rope. Clara stepped into the room, then holding an envelope. They sent this too, she said. Inside, a photograph of Grace and Annalise as toddlers, together. No tags, no medical IDs, just two children in a sunlit field. On the back, scrawled in ink, return what was never yours. Annalisa snatched it. They're trying to split us. Clara nodded. They want you to think one of you was chosen and one was discarded, Grace whispered. And maybe they did. Annalisa turned, eyes blazing. What? What if I was the chosen one? Grace said. What if everything, the estate, the name, the spotlight, was designed for me, and you were the test case? Silence. Clara stepped between them. That's what they want you to believe. But listen to me. Arthur never cared who succeeded. He only cared that one of you broke. Later that night, Grace sat alone in her father's old study. She played his last audio file again. They'll come for you, Gracie, but you're not like them. You don't destroy, you reveal. That's what makes you dangerous. The next morning, Grace arrived at the Redgrave Towers, alone. She entered. A private conference room. Robert and Bellamy waited inside, two kings without crowns. Robert spoke first. You have the originals? Grace said nothing. Bellamy leaned forward. This isn't about you. It never was. You were a vehicle, a vessel. The real threat is what happens if the doctrine collapses globally. Grace met his gaze. That's the idea. Robert raised a hand. We'll give you what you want. A foundation in your father's name, full rehabilitation of your mother's record, a public apology. You'll be a hero. And Annalise? Grace asked. She's unstable, Bellamy said. She can't be part of this. She's not safe. Grace stood. Neither are you. That night she returned to the estate. Annalisa was waiting by the fire, tense. Well, she asked. Grace said nothing, just handed her a file. Inside, the full doctrine, signed, scanned, unredacted. You're giving it to me, Annalisa asked. Grace nodded. You were the secret, she said. Now be the storm. Annalisa took the file, and for the first time in days, she smiled. The video dropped at 6 a.m. sharp, a 20-minute compilation of everything, the Redgrave Doctrine, the vault scans, the ARC facility photos, the Willow files, the Blue folder, and the global contracts. It wasn't narrated, no music, no edits. Just documents, footage, whispers from Henry Holloway's recordings, and the final irrefutable closing line. Silence was their weapon. This is ours. Within hours, the world convulsed. Hashtags surged, protests ignited, whistleblowers from other countries stepped forward. Officials resigned. CEO statements began flooding media with carefully crafted apologies. Every major news outlet scrambled to cover the story they had once ignored, and the Redgraves, isolated, cornered. Grace watched it unfold from the Redgrave Library. her father's notebook open beside her. Each line of his cramped handwriting felt heavier now. He had built a road map. She had followed it. And now the walls were crumbling. Clara stood by the window. "Do you understand what you've done?" she whispered. "Yes," Grace said. "I ended them." "No," Clara replied. "You started something else, something that can't be stopped." Meanwhile, Annalisa stayed hidden, but she was watching, monitoring the feeds, checking networks for retaliation. She said little, only giving clipped updates, until she didn't. That evening, Grace walked into the study to find Annalisa, holding a document, pale, trembling. It was a letter, one of Bellamy's final orders before the project was shut down. Subject 3B, fail-safe protocol, induce psychological destabilization if exposure threshold exceeded. Grace's eyes widened. "They programmed you," she whispered. Annalise stared at her, breath shallow. "They built a kill switch for me." A long silence followed. Then she laughed, sharp, bitter. "Of course they did." Grace stepped forward. "We'll find a way to reverse it. They don't own you anymore." But Annalisa's expression twisted. "Don't you get it? They built me to self-destruct the moment I got too close. You were the one meant to survive. I was the decoy, the disaster waiting to happen." Grace froze. "That's not true." But even she wasn't sure anymore. That night, Grace made one final call. To Elise. "Prepare the files, all of them, and release them to every press outlet. Don't wait, don't protect me, don't protect Annalisa. Just let it burn." Elise hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Grace whispered. "We've come too far to be careful now." The release dropped at midnight, unfiltered, unredacted, and the headlines erupted. The Red Grave Doctrine was global, and it was built to break people. Some governments fell, some revolted, but most watched in terror and in silence. Annalise vanished that night, left a note, just 5 words. "I'm not their sentence anymore." Grace didn't chase her. She stood on the estate balcony, watching the sky turn grey, her father's ring clenched in her fist. She had become the voice they tried to mute. But the cost, that was still being calculated. The mansion was quiet now, not the deceptive stillness of power being reshuffled in back rooms, but true quiet, the kind that settles after a storm. Rooms stood half empty. Paintings had been removed, staff dismissed. Clara was gone. Andrew had disappeared from headlines, his name becoming just another footnote in the wreckage. Grace stood alone in the center of the east corridor. The wall, where the vault once was, now bore something new, a plaque. It read, "In memory of those silenced to preserve a lie." Beneath it, Henry Holloway's name. And Rebecca Holloway's. She touched the engraved metal gently, then turned toward the press waiting outside the estate. Reporters clustered at the gates, voices raised, hands waving, questions coming fast. She stepped to the podium. No lawyers, no teleprompters, just Grace. "I'm not here to speak about guilt," she began, "not about court cases, verdicts, or settlements. I'm here to speak about names." She paused. "Names are what they use to control us, through signatures, contracts, medical labels. Discrediting those who asked questions, imprisoning those who knew too much, erasing those who survived. But we remember them now." The crowd quieted. She reached into her coat and pulled out one last document. Her father's original whistleblower letter, unedited, handwritten. It read, "If I don't make it, let this prove one thing. They never controlled the truth. They only delayed it." Grace continued, "I won't accept money, I won't rebuild this house, and I won't wear this last name." She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small ID card. A legal name change. Grace Redgrave. Gone. She held up the new card. "Grace Holloway. I've always been his daughter. That's the only legacy I need." She stepped down, walked past the cameras, past the screaming voices, and disappeared behind the estate's gates. Inside, she left one last file on the grand piano in the drawing room. It was labeled Project Forgotten. The contents: testimonies, writings, names, not for the courts, for the world. As she walked through the ruined garden, the morning sun finally cracked the clouds. She looked up, eyes narrowed, and whispered, "You buried us in silence, but we were always seeds." If you've made it this far, let us know what you thought about the story. Rate it from 1 to 10 in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you're not subscribed yet, don't forget to subscribe to catch all our upcoming stories.